Brigitta Summers explores the construction of parklands environments through the axes of fig tree planted in Hyde Park, Sydney Park, and the parklands surrounding Curl Curl. These triangulations between sites look at the multiplication of planted trees. Summers depicts these through angular layers of CMYK print and rice paper mould imprints on trees. They follow Summers' preoccupation with talking with trees, exploring alternative relations between human and non-human entities that emphasise dialogic and reciprocal engagements with the world. So you've made two approaches with this work. Let's start with your work at Curl Curl in Sydney Park through these rice paper imprints. These are essentially tree negatives and they show an inverted section. So firstly, can you tell us a bit about fig trees you've represented and how this is keeping in line with your preoccupation to talk with trees?
Yeah, so this kind of mould making practice came out of my master's where I actually cast the moulds, and just through kind of not having a lot of time to prepare the work for this show, and then also like you sending through all that information there about the historical work that like a local historian did around a particular fig tree in the area, that kind of created this really nice convergence where my work is really thinking about, or I'm trying to think about how to express the embodied history of trees. So the way trees respond and create their environments in their specific localities. So these moulds are really about the capturing that embodied history. And so then when you sent me through the archival material, I thought, oh, if I can work this into the moulds, then there's a kind of coming together of the embodied history of the tree with the human history, and there's this like a meeting point in the line of the kind of like there's like a fold line between the tree and the mould where they have shaped each other. And so that was like a really nice kind of almost accidental like discovery, yeah, right at the end of my thinking about this whole process. And my interest in fig trees really came about because of my interest in, or like my experience of Hyde Park. Like I love fig trees and I find them very expressive. You know, like they have such gnarled bark, and then they seem to really express that embodied history in a way that is quite obvious, that other trees are perhaps less obvious about. But I also find them to be very just powerful beings, I guess. So that's kind of why, so it started with the Hyde Park work, and then when I realised there are lots of the same kinds of fig tree here, that's why it kind of became about these like fig trees across dispersed sites in Sydney.
Because parklands are often like more constructed than we would know, and by using fig trees and the way that fig trees kind of spread their seeds over time and where they're planted and things like that, like it really creates this like interesting relationship between human and nature. So in your master's thesis, you were preoccupied mostly with the bleeding heart tree, which is this rainforest tree. Are you moving towards looking at other tree types in your future practice?
I mean, my interest in parklands is really related to my interest in how image technology shapes the way we see landscape. So, and parks are a good expression of that because they're often created with this like normative ideal about like a beautiful landscape and the picturesque, particularly in a colonial context. And so then somewhere like Hyde Park, where native trees, fig trees, have been used to create these kind of like a colonial avenue, a very colonial style of parkland that fulfills colonial ideas of beauty and order, is an interesting relationship to me. On the one hand, the fig tree is kind of appropriated into this colonial framework, but on the other hand, do the fig trees start to subvert that? Because then also like I don't know if you've been to Hyde Park at night, but there's lots of possums. So it becomes like a kind of
and a new habitat.
New habitat. It supports like native wildlife. So then, but then there's also like a tension where the fig trees, like a lot of them have, I think it's Phytophthora, like fungi rot. And so at one stage they were just going to rip them all down and take them all out. And now they're doing that in a sort of progressive, they're monitoring the trees. So the trees are actually kind of failing to fulfill this colonial expectation that has been put on them.
And Gary Castley in 2008 did a show called On Bark where he looked at a lot of Hyde Park areas and how parklands like Hyde Park kind of are mirrored landscape-wise to some parks in Singapore and other like places around the world. And I did find that like aspect of replication in the way that they're produced really interesting that you explore, especially as you've triangulated these free parkland sort of areas and where the figs actually come and work from there. So there was another happy surprise that happened in the install of this show, and that's when Crystal brought out a fossil like offcuts from her casts, and they're almost materially reflected to your work in one, the white kind of cast presentation of them, but also down to the very hooks that you both ended up using just by hapstance. So as your two approaches also triangulate Penny's wetlands, how do you think all of these jutting works speak to the concept of mass?
That's quite a hard question, Daniel.
Okay, sorry.
I was really like pleased and interested to see that like Crystal and I ended up with also showing like a mould, the mould element of the work. Obviously I didn't show the cast, but you know, and I think that was also like a really interesting theme from materiality, was there was a lot of cast work, and like Emma also often does casting, and there seems to be something about like casting from nature that comes up a lot in when people are thinking in this ecological way. And for me, that relates to this idea of the impression. So that's something I've become really interested in since finishing my master's, is the idea of like, that meeting point when you create a mould from something, and the translations between the thing, the mould, the cast from the mould, and there's physical, the physical touch of the mould to nature. And so I think it's really cool that like Crystal has also kind of brought that element of it in, and it speaks really nicely, and I think is a really nice tie back to the materiality show as well.
Yeah, and I think, I guess in mass in this kind of context, I think it really speaks to, because there's just so many cast works that like, you know, there is this sheer kind of idea of imprint and mimicry and stuff that exists across ecology as a whole.
Well, because for me, like the interesting part of the mould or the imprint is that it's a relationship between like absence and presence. So there's a kind of, I don't know, there's like a kind of melancholiness to a mould, because it's a representation of an absence, as well as being a kind of presence, and that to me is very poetic in the context of climate crisis and the loss, the sheer like amount of loss that is happening in the world today.
And in materiality, you had a plaster cast, but this is actually kind of what I would consider kind of a more pure transfer, which is just rice paper, and then it's water substrate and something else, or is that really the whole shebang?
No, it's like rice glue,
okay.
And then rice paper pieces, and I just like paint the rice glue on, and then stick it to the tree, and then just kind of mash it into the tree with a brush. To pick up all the detail. And it takes a bit of residue from it, which I think is like a really nice like quality of it. But the other aspect of that is like, you were saying it was like related to a very like old type of printmaking transfers or mold making? So I developed this technique because of my dad's actually a letterpress printer. So there's like a long history of the connection to various kinds of printing. And back in the day when everything was done letterpress, like they're actually technically like what I would call stereotypes. So a stereotype was a mould made from a page of set type, and the mould was made with paper. So it was a paper mould that was then beaten into the form of the type and then taken off and then recast in metal. So yeah, like it all kind of ties into my intersecting interests of printmaking, like yeah.
And it is interesting seeing that family influence in your practice, like with your mum being a bookmaker as well, and all of that kind of harmoniously coming through in little ways. So the next thing is I'm going to bring you to that work here. So your other work here is called "The Image is the Thing, the Image precedes the thing," and it almost has this vibrational color combination between cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, and it's all hand drawn onto perspex.
Oh, it's hand drawn and then screen printed onto perspex.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Sorry.
Can you tell me a bit about this work and if there's any like color vibrational aspects to your experience of Hyde Park, I guess?
I mean, so the technique is sort of riffing off the traditional printmaking technique of separating color images into the 4 colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which in their overlap gives you not the full spectrum, but a full enough spectrum to kind of represent like color. And it's how everything was printed for decades before digital printing was invented. So the idea between separating the layers, so each color is printed on a separate piece of perspex, or acrylic, it's not technically perspex. Each color is printed onto a separate piece of acrylic, and because obviously the acrylic has a dimension, that means that there's a kind of depth to the image. And so for me, relates to 2 kind of elements. One is I'm interested in the idea of, like, as with the molds, this idea of like layers of history that are embedded in the landscape and then also become embedded in the tree. So there's a kind of there's like a layering thing happening between the 2 different works. And then it also relates to this idea of like image and print technology and how images as a technology in and of themselves create our expectations around landscape and the way we think about and picture landscape. So, you know, just like even the idea of the word picturesque, if you describe something as picturesque, what you're literally saying is it looks like a picture. And that's something that we value. So kind of like what May was saying, like in the Chinese landscape tradition, it's about the experience. In the Western landscape tradition, it's about the way things look. And I find that's very dominant and really creates like normative ideals about, for example, park making and landscaping and landscape gardening. And it's about a particular kind of, like, yes, a physical experience, but that is perhaps like about a series of unfolding views.
Yeah, and the picturesque.
So that you move from one spot to another and it opens up a particular vista. And that's something I'm really interested in terms of how that then, like, so if we make an image that subverts that, how does that then change how we see landscape and the way that has developed over kind of art history through art history. Well, one artist that was really influential was Claude Lorraine, who painted these like particular style of landscape painting. And then in the colonial kind of times, they had this thing called a Claude glass, which was a mirrored glass, sort of in like a brass mirror, that you would hold up to the landscape and then look at the reflection of the landscape. So you could create a landscape painting from the landscape that you were looking at.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Yeah.
And then that was really influential on an English landscape gardener whose name was Capability Brown, who then designed all of these English landscape gardens to actually look like paintings and would create these natural looking landscapes, but they had, like, you know, the nice clump of trees over there and the lake down there. And then those ideas got translated into an Australian context in these really interesting ways.
And I guess there's a little bit of like karaoke or lost in translation aspects that like come across when it's replicated in a landscape where the soil might not like yield in the same way that English soil will yield, and like the way that plants and stuff actually like live and exist like in this cultivated sort of thing is almost like this artifice. So it's really interesting in that respect. I was going to ask you a little bit about your use of transparency in this, and is this a first, like using because usually you'll have a white background, or like it will be very paper-like, even if it's not paper itself. So moving into something that's transparent, like what do you think that opened up for your practice?
I mean, it did feel really weird to like use all this plastic. Like the ink is also basically plastic, the perspex is plastic. I was like, oh, this feels so wrong. But just the ability to, I guess it's like that idea of the depth, and to have, so that it's not just on a single plane, but it actually has, like, it recedes. And so to have that transparency allows you to look into the work in a way that makes that layering really obvious, and also then creates like a kind of experiential viewing where as you move from one side to the work or up or down, it actually changes how the work looks. And so then that gives you like your body is involved in the viewing. It doesn't have a single viewpoint.
Yeah.
Which I guess also then subverts that idea of the viewpoint.
And I think just the optical kind of illusion that you create, like I remember during opening night, it had like a lot of people just looking at the way that like you'd be able to kind of shift the colors as you kind of move from one side to the other. Do you think that's like something that you want to activate as far as like your concept of thinking with trees? Like it really does create that real engagement and like close interaction with them.
Yeah, that was the goal. Yeah.
So
you nailed it.
Well done there then. So with parks, this will be my last question. With parks being a new fixation in your practice, can you tell me about some of your favourite parkland locations, and is there anywhere new you plan to make new work?
Well, I really want to keep kind of working in this way. So I guess one thing I didn't mention is that the actual spatiality of Hyde Park is built into this work through the angles. So each colour is on a different angle. That's traditional in CMYK printing. Each colour is on so that they overlap but not completely. And the angles that I used in this work relate to kind of axes of travel through Hyde Park. So the yellow was on, all those walkways that kind of crisscross Hyde Park are represented, or some of them are represented in this work. And so that's something that I want to take into, like, I'd like to explore that more, because as you change the angles, it changes the dynamics of the image. So I'd really like to keep kind of working in this way in different parks and think about how that spatiality of a place can also be represented and change the nature of the image. So yeah, I'm definitely going to keep doing this.
Fair enough. Thank you so much, Brigitta.
Thanks, Daniel.